The day my church announced the mortgage was finally paid off, my own family stood behind me, whispering about how I probably couldn't even afford my heating bill.
After all these years, how could you keep this from us?
I heard my daughter-in-law Melissa sigh loud enough for me to catch it.
Look at her, she's devastated.
Poor
This
Brandon.
is exactly what I was talking about.
She can barely take care of herself.
Don't put this on me right now, not in front of her.
I didn't turn around. I didn't defend myself.
You can't just stand there like nothing happened, Mother. We deserve an explanation after all this time. You owe us that much.
And the worst part, I had no intention of ever telling them. If you've ever been misunderstood by the very people who are supposed to know you best, I think you'll understand this story. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps me share stories like this with others who need them. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I'd really love to know. My name is Brandon Westlake, and if you saw me walking down the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. I'm 64 years old. I live alone in a small, aging house just outside Columbus, Ohio. The paint on the porch is peeling, the mailbox leans slightly to the left, and my Cara faded blue Ford from nearly 2 decades ago creaks louder than it should every time I turn the ignition. To most people, I suppose I look like a woman who's just getting by. And to my family, I look like someone who's already fallen behind. It wasn't always like this. 12 years ago, when my husband Thomas passed away, everything shifted. Not all at once. No, that would have been easier to understand. Instead, it happened slowly, like a draft sneaking through a closed window. At first, my son Ethan came by more often. He'd sit at my kitchen table drinking coffee, telling me about his new job in real estate. He was doing well, better than I ever had at his age, or at least that's what I told him. I learned from the best, he used to say, smiling at me. Back then, I believed him. But success changes people in quiet ways. The visits became shorter. The phone calls became less frequent. And when Ethan did come by, he wasn't alone anymore. That's when Melissa entered the picture. Melissa Westlake, my daughter-in-law, was the kind of woman who noticed everything, especially the things she didn't like. The first time she stepped into my house, her eyes moved quickly over the worn couch, the outdated wallpaper, the chipped wooden table Thomas had built with his own hands. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's cozy," she said. I knew what she meant. After they got married, things changed faster. Family dinners turned into something I began to dread. Melissa would talk about her friends' vacations, their new homes, their renovations. She had a way of telling those stories that felt less like sharing and more like measuring. Well, not everyone prioritizes those things, she'd say, casually glancing in my direction. Ethan rarely corrected her. Sometimes he'd even join in. "Mom's always been simple," he'd say, as if explaining me to someone else. "She doesn't need much." I would smile. I always smiled, because correcting them would mean explaining something I wasn't ready to explain. And maybe a part of me wanted to see how far their assumptions would go. My sister Diane didn't help. Diane Carter had always been opinionated. Even as children, she had a way of deciding what was right for everyone else. After Thomas died, she started checking in on me more often, but not out of concern. Not really. "You shouldn't be living alone at your age," she'd say, standing in my doorway with her arms crossed. "It's not safe. And honestly, Brandon, this place, it's falling apart." I would nod politely. "I manage just fine," I'd reply. But Diane never listened. One afternoon, she sat across from me at the same table Thomas had built and leaned in, slightly lowering her voice as if sharing something confidential. "Ethan told me he's worried about you," she said. "He thinks you might be struggling financially." I remember pausing, my fingers wrapped around my coffee mug. "Did he say that?" I asked. Diane nodded. "Well, can you blame him?" she continued. "Look around, Brandon. You don't exactly scream stable." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. If only she knew. But that was the thing. None of them knew. and none of them had ever asked. My life to them was something they observed from the outside, like a house they assumed was empty simply because the lights were dim. But inside that empty house, there were things they couldn't see. Things I had built quietly over decades. Things I had protected even from the people I loved. I didn't need expensive clothes or a new car. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. After Thomas died, I found comfort in simplicity, in routines and quiet mornings, in the familiar creak of the floorboards as I walked from one room to another. And most of all, I found comfort in the one place that never judged me: the church. St. Andrew's wasn't large, it wasn't impressive, but it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. People there knew my name not because of what I had, but because of who I was. Every Sunday, I sat in the third pew from the front right side near the aisle. It had become my place over the years. Pastor Michael Harris would always greet me with the same gentle smile. "Good to see you, Brandon," he'd say, and he meant it. At church, no one cared that my coat was old or that my shoes had been repaired more times than I could count. No one asked about my finances or made assumptions about my life. They just accepted me. And after everything I had lost, that kind of acceptance felt like a lifeline. But even there, things were beginning to change. I noticed it first in the way Pastor Michael spoke during service. Longer pauses, heavier sighs. Then came the subtle mentions during announcements. "We're facing some challenges," he said one Sunday, "but with faith, we'll find a way." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Churches always had challenges: repairs, maintenance donations. It was part of keeping the doors open. But then one afternoon after service, I saw something that made my chest tighten. Pastor Michael was standing near the office, speaking quietly with one of the church board members. Their voices were low, but the concern in their expressions was unmistakable. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. "The bank isn't willing to extend again," the board member said. "And the remaining balance?" Pastor Michael asked. There was a pause. "Too much," came the reply. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not yet. But something close, because for the first time I realized the place that had held me together for over a decade was beginning to fall apart, and no one, not even the people who loved it most, seemed to know how to save it. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, my heart beating just a little faster. Then I turned quietly and walked out into the cold Ohio afternoon. That was the moment everything began. Not with a grand decision, not with a dramatic realization, but with a simple, unsettling truth. The one place that had never turned its back on me was about to be taken away. And I wasn't sure if I could bear losing it too. If there is one thing I learned after Thomas passed, it's that people don't always say what they truly think. Sometimes they don't have to. Sometimes it shows in the way they look at you, or the way they pause before they speak. Or worse, the way they speak when they think you won't notice. It was a Sunday afternoon when it became impossible for me to ignore. Ethan had invited me over for dinner. It had been a while since the last invitation, and for a moment, just a small moment, I let myself believe that maybe things were changing. Maybe he missed me. Maybe Melissa had softened. I even brought dessert. Apple pie from scratch, the way Thomas used to like it. When I arrived, Melissa opened the door with that same practiced smile. "Brandon, you didn't have to bring anything," she said, though. Her eyes dropped immediately to the pie dish in my hands. "I wanted to," I replied gently. She stepped aside, letting me in. "The house was—" "Brandon, you didn't have to bring anything?" she said, though her eyes dropped immediately to the pie dish in my hands. I wanted to, I replied gently. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house was beautiful. I'll give them that. Everything was polished, coordinated, expensive. It didn't feel lived in, it felt displayed. Ethan was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink. "Hey, Mom," he said, barely glancing up. "You made it." I smiled. Of course I did. We sat down at the table, and for a while everything felt normal. Melissa talked about a couple she knew who had just bought a lake house. Ethan chimed in about rising property values. I listened. I nodded. I've always been a good listener. Then somewhere between the main course and dessert, the conversation shifted. It always does. "So, Brandon," Melissa said, casually cutting into her steak, "have you thought any more about downsizing?" I paused. "Downsizing," I repeated. "Yes," she said, as if it were obvious. "Your house is quite large for just one person. And well, it must be expensive to maintain." Ethan finally looked up. "She's right, Mom," he added. "That place is old. Repairs alone must be costing you a fortune." I set my fork down carefully. "It's manageable," I said. Melissa gave a small, sympathetic smile. "I just worry about you," she said, "especially with everything getting more expensive these days. Utilities, groceries, it adds up." Her tone was gentle. Too gentle. "I'm doing fine," I replied. Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Are you?" he asked. There it was. Not concern. Doubt. "I mean, you don't really talk about money," he continued, "and you've always been private about it. But, Mom, you don't have to struggle alone." Struggle. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. "I'm not struggling," I said. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. It was subtle, but I saw it. That look people give each other when they think someone else is in denial. "Well," she said lightly, "there's no shame in needing help." I nodded slowly. "I know." Ethan sighed, as if this conversation was exhausting him. "Look, Mom," he said, leaning forward now. "We've been talking, and we think it might be best if you consider selling the house." There it was. Not a suggestion. A plan. I felt my hands go still in my lap. "Selling it?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "You could move somewhere smaller. Maybe even a retirement community. It would be safer. Easier." Melissa nodded enthusiastically. "And you'd have people around you all the time," she added. "Activity support. It's really the smart choice." I looked at both of them. For a moment, I didn't see my son. I saw two people discussing a problem. And I realized the problem was me. "I'm not interested in moving," I said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Mom, you're not thinking about this realistically." "I am," I replied. "No," he insisted. "You're being stubborn." Melissa placed her hand gently on his arm, as if calming him, but her eyes were still on me. "We just want what's best for you," she said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so rehearsed. "What's best for me?" I repeated softly. "Yes," Ethan said. "And honestly, maintaining that house with your situation, it doesn't make sense." "My situation." I let that sink in. "What situation is that exactly?" I asked. There was a brief silence. Melissa looked at Ethan as if encouraging him to say it. He hesitated. "Then, your financial situation," he said. There it was, out in the open. I nodded slowly. "I see." Ethan leaned back again, as if relieved to have said it. "We're just trying to be practical," he added. Practical. That word again. Everything to them was practical. Numbers, assets, decisions. They saw life like a spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, I was a liability. Diane joined us later that evening. She hadn't been invited to dinner, but that had never stopped her before. "Oh, good you're all talking about this," she said as she walked in, removing her coat. "I've been telling Brandon the same thing for months." Of course she had. Someone needs to be honest with her. Diane continued, sitting down without asking. "She's living like it's still 20 years ago." I felt my patience thinning just slightly. "I'm right here," I said calmly. "I know," Diane replied. "That's why I'm saying it." Ethan rubbed his temples. Diane were trying to handle this gently. Gently, she scoffed. "She needs reality, not gentle." Melissa nodded in agreement. And just like that, 3 against 1, I looked down at the apple pie I had brought. Untouched. "Of course. Let me ask you something," I said, lifting my gaze back to them. "When did you all decide I couldn't take care of myself?" No one answered immediately. Because the truth was, they didn't have a moment. It had just become their belief. "We're not saying that," Ethan said finally. "You are," I replied. "Just not in so many words." Melissa shifted in her seat. "We're saying you might need help?" she corrected. I smiled faintly. "And what makes you think I don't already have everything I need?" Diane laughed. "Oh, Brandon," she said. "If you had everything you needed, you wouldn't be living like this, as if my life was something broken, something to be fixed." I stood slowly smoothing my hands over my skirt. "I think it's time for me to go," I said. Ethan frowned. "Mom, it's getting late," I interrupted gently. Melissa stood as well, already reaching for my coat. "I'll walk you out," she said. Of course she would. At the door, she handed me my coat and gave me that same polite smile. "You know we care about you," she said. I looked at her for a moment. Then I nodded. "I know," I replied, but as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. They didn't care about me. Not really. They cared about the version of me they had created in their minds. The helpless widow, the struggling mother, the woman who couldn't keep up. And for the first time, I wondered how they would react if they ever saw the truth. Not the version they believed, but the one I had been quietly protecting all along. Because something told me the woman who couldn't keep up. And for the first time, I wondered how they would react if they ever saw the truth. Not the version they believed, but the one I had been quietly protecting all along. Because something told me they wouldn't recognize me at all. That night after I left Ethan's house, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove. Not anywhere in particular, just down familiar roads, past places that still held pieces of a life no one seemed to remember anymore. The grocery store where Thomas and I used to argue over brands of cereal. The park where we walked every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine. The office building where I spent nearly 30 years of my life. I slowed as I passed it. The lights were still on inside, even though it was late. A different company occupied the space now, but I could still picture the way it used to look, the glass doors, the polished floors, the quiet hum of a place that never really slept. That building had once been mine in a way, not in ownership, but in responsibility, in control, in understanding. I had been the chief financial officer of a regional logistics company, Midwest Freight Solutions. It wasn't a flashy title, but it carried weight. Decisions, numbers, consequences. I had overseen budgets that would have made Ethan's head spin, negotiated contracts, managed crises, saved that company from collapse more than once, and I had done it quietly, just like everything else in my life. When Thomas got sick, I stepped down, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There are moments in life when priorities become painfully clear. And for me, sitting beside him in hospital rooms mattered more than any boardroom ever could. After he passed, the company offered to bring me back. Higher salary, better benefits, more authority. I declined. People thought I was grieving, and I was, but that wasn't the only reason. I had already made my plans long before Thomas took his last breath. Careful plans, thoughtful plans. The kind of plans you make when you understand money, not just how to earn it, but how to protect it. While others were spending, upgrading, expanding, I was saving, investing, building something that didn't need to be seen to be real. I bought properties when the market dipped. I held onto stocks when others panicked. I diversified, calculated, waited. Patience is something people underestimate, especially when it comes to money. By the time I officially retired, I had more than enough. Not just to survive, but to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Quietly. On my terms. And that's exactly what I chose. Not a bigger house, not a newer car, not a lifestyle that needed to be explained or justified. Just peace. But peace, I learned, can be mistaken for weakness, especially by people who only measure value in what they can see. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The silence inside the car was thick but not uncomfortable, just honest. I sat there for a moment, staring at the front of my house. Yes, the paint was chipped. Yes, the roof needed attention. Yes, it wasn't impressive, but it was mine. Every corner of it held memories that no one else could replace. And more importantly, it held independence, something I wasn't willing to give up. Not for Ethan, not for Melissa, not even for Diane. I stepped out of the car and made my way inside. The familiar creak of the floor greeted me. The faint scent of old wood and lavender lingered in the air. I set my purse down and walked into the living room where Thomas's photograph still sat on the shelf. I picked it up. "You'd have laughed tonight," I said softly. I could almost hear him. That quiet chuckle of his. The one that came when he found something absurd, but not worth arguing over. "They think I'm broke." I continued, a faint smile tugging at my lips. If anything, Thomas had always worried I was too careful with money. "Brandon," he used to say, "you can enjoy it too, right?" And I always gave him the same answer. I am enjoying it, just differently. I set the photograph back down and moved toward the small desk in the corner of the room. Inside the top drawer was a folder. Simple, unlabeled. I opened it. Inside were documents, statements, account summaries, property records. Numbers that told a story no one else knew. I flipped through them slowly, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me, reminded me. I wasn't who they thought I was, not even close. There was a time shortly after Thomas passed when Ethan had asked me directly about money. "Are you going to be okay?" he had said, and I had told him the truth. "Yes," I said, "it'll be fine," but I didn't elaborate. I didn't list accounts or explain investments or reassure him with numbers, because something in his tone had felt off. Not concern, not entirely, curiosity, the kind that looks for opportunity. And from that moment on, I made a decision. I would never let money become the reason my family stayed close to me. If they were going to be in my life, it would have to be for me, not what I had, not what I could give. And over time, their distance gave me my answer. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. That decision had shaped everything that came after. Every quiet moment, every overlooked detail, Every assumption they made about me, I let them believe what they wanted, that I was struggling, that I was falling behind, that I needed saving, because in a strange way, it protected me from expectations, from demands, from becoming something I never wanted to be, a source of convenience. But now, things were changing. The conversation at dinner had made that clear. They weren't just assuming anymore. They were planning my future without me. And that was something I couldn't ignore. Not anymore. I walked back to the window and looked out into the dark street. A single streetlight flickered at the corner. Everything else was still. Quiet. Just the way I liked it. But beneath that quiet, something had shifted. Not in my finances, not in my home, but in me. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt something stronger than patience, stronger than restraint. I felt, but beneath that quiet, something had shifted. Not in my finances, not in my home, but in me. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt something stronger than patience, stronger than restraint. I felt clarity, and with that clarity came a simple realization. If they wanted to believe I was weak, if they wanted to treat me like I had nothing, then maybe it was time I stopped protecting them from the truth. Not by telling them, but by showing them, in a way they would never forget. And somehow, I had a feeling that moment was closer than any of us realized. The following Sunday, I arrived at church earlier than usual. Not because I had to, but because something inside me wouldn't let me stay home. There are moments in life when you feel a quiet pull. Not loud, not urgent, but steady. Like something unseen is asking you to pay attention. That morning felt like one of those moments. The parking lot was only half full when I pulled in. A thin layer of frost still clung to the grass, and the air carried that familiar Ohio chill that settles deep in your bones. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and stepped out of the car. St. Andrew's stood exactly as it always had. Simple, unassuming. But to me, it had always been more than that. It was where I learned more than that. It was where I learned how to stand on my own after Thomas died. Where I cried without being asked why. Where silence didn't feel empty. I walked inside slowly, my footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. A few people were already there, setting up for the service. Mrs. Patterson waved from across the room. "Morning, Brandon," she called. "Good morning," I replied, smiling gently. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that lingered just beneath the surface. I made my way to my usual seat, the third pew right side, and sat down. For a few minutes I just breathed, listened, waited. More people began to arrive. Conversations filled the room, soft laughter, the usual greetings. But then I noticed something. Pastor Michael. He stood near the front, speaking with two members of the church board. His posture was different, tense. His hands moved as he spoke quick, controlled gestures that I had never seen from him before. And his smile was missing. I watched for a moment longer than I should have. Then I looked away. Because sometimes you don't need to hear words to understand what's being said. The service began as usual. Hymns, prayers, scripture. But there was something different in Pastor Michael's voice. A weight, a hesitation, as if every word he spoke had something unspoken behind it. And then, toward the end of the service, it came. The moment I had been feeling all morning. He stepped forward, adjusting the microphone slightly. "There's something I need to share with all of you," he said. The room quieted instantly. Even the smallest movement seemed to stop. I felt my hands fold together in my lap instinctively. Pastor Michael took a breath. "As many of you know, our church has been facing financial challenges for some time now." A few heads nodded. "Yes," he continued. "We've managed to keep things running, to maintain our services, to support our community. But there is something we can no longer delay." He paused. And in that pause, I felt it. That same tightening in my chest from a few days earlier. "The mortgage on this building," he said carefully, "is still outstanding." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, but enough. "We've worked with the bank to extend deadlines to restructure payments, but we've reached a point where they're no longer willing to wait." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. "If we cannot meet the remaining balance," he continued, his voice softer, "now we risk losing this building." Someone gasped. A quiet, broken sound. I closed my eyes for just a moment, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way nothing else could. This church, Pastor Michael said, looking around the room, is more than just walls and a roof. It's a home for many of us. A place of comfort. A place of faith. His voice trembled slightly. "And I know that many of you have already given so much. Time, effort, support. But now we're being asked to give something more." I opened my eyes again. Around me, I saw faces I had known for years. Elderly couples, single mothers, people who barely had enough for themselves. And yet they were listening, hoping. "We will be organizing a fundraising effort," he continued. "Any contribution, no matter how small, will help." I felt something shift inside me again. Stronger this time. Not just concern, not just sadness, something deeper. "This is not something I ask lightly," he added. "But I believe in this community, and I believe that together we can find a way." He stepped back, and just like that, the service ended, but no one moved right away. People sat in their seats processing, whispering, some wiping away tears. I remained where I was, my hands still folded, because I knew something they didn't. I knew how much a remaining balance could mean. I knew what too much looked like on paper. And I knew this wasn't something bake sales and small donations could fix. Not this time. Eventually, people began to stand to gather their things. Conversations started forming quiet, worried, uncertain. I stood slowly, my legs feeling heavier than usual. As I walked toward the exit, I saw Pastor Michael again. This time, he wasn't speaking. He was simply standing there, greeting people as they left. But his smile, it didn't reach his eyes. When I reached him, he looked at me and nodded. "Thank you for coming, Brandon," he said. "Of course," I replied. I hesitated, just slightly. "Then Pastor Michael," I said softly. He looked at me, waiting. That remaining balance, I began choosing my words carefully. "Is it significant?" He held my gaze for a moment, and in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not just concern, not just worry, but exhaustion. "Yes," he said quietly. I nodded. "I see. I didn't ask for numbers. I didn't need to, because the way he said it told me everything." "Thank you," I added gently. Then I walked away, out into the cold, back to my car. But I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, thinking, feeling, remembering. All the Sundays, this place had given me something I didn't even know I needed. All the quiet moments that had helped me stand again. And now, it was slipping away. Not because people didn't care, but because caring wasn't enough. I stared ahead, my reflection faintly visible in the windshield. And slowly, a thought began to form. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. What if I could help? Not in small ways, not in pieces, but in the one way that actually mattered. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, because I already knew the answer. I could. The real question was, would I? And if I did, what would it change, not just for the church, but for everything else in my life? Because something told me this wouldn't stay a secret forever, and when it came out, nothing would be the same again. I didn't make the decision right away. That would have been easier, cleaner. But life has a way of placing weight on your heart and then waiting, just long enough for you to feel every ounce of it before you act. For 3 days, I said nothing. I went about my routine like I always did. Morning coffee by the window. A short walk down Maple Street. Reading in the afternoon. But underneath it all, there was something constant. A quiet pressure. Every time I thought about the church, a short walk down Maple Street. Reading in the afternoon. But underneath it all, there was something constant. A quiet pressure. Every time I thought about the church, about those pews, those people, those quiet moments that had held me together when everything else fell apart, I felt it again. That pull. By the 4th day, I knew. Not because it made sense, but because I couldn't ignore it anymore. That afternoon, I picked up the phone. My hand hovered over the numbers for a moment longer than it should have. Then, I dialed. It rang twice. St. Andrew's Church, this is Michael. His voice sounded tired. More tired than I remembered. Pastor Michael. It's Brandon, I said. There was a brief pause. Brandon, he replied, a hint of warmth returning. It's good to hear from you. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. No, he said quickly. Not at all. I took a breath. I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk. In person. Another pause. Longer this time. Of course, he said. Are you at home? I can come by. No, I replied gently. I'd prefer to come to the church. All right, he said. You'll be here. I hung up the phone and sat there for a moment. Still, because I knew once I walked through those doors again, things would begin to change. Not just for the church, but for me. The drive there felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the road itself understood what I was about to do. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. The building stood still, almost waiting. I stepped inside. The air was cooler than usual, the silence deeper. Pastor Michael was in his office, the door slightly open. He looked up as I knocked softly. Brandon, he said, standing quickly. Please come in. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit, he said. I did. He sat down as well, folding his hands together. I had a feeling this might be about Sunday, he said carefully. I nodded. Yes. He waited. He didn't rush me. That was something I had always appreciated about him. He knew how to give silent space. I've been thinking about what you said, I began. His expression tightened slightly. I wish I had better news, he admitted. I'm not here for news, I said quietly. That caught his attention. He leaned forward just slightly. Then what are you here for? I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let a piece of the truth come through. I want to know the exact amount, I said. His brow furrowed. The remaining balance, I clarified. He hesitated. Brandon. He began, his tone cautious. That's not something you need to worry about. I'm asking, I said gently but firmly. He studied me for a moment, not judging, just trying to understand. It's a significant amount, he said again. I know, I replied. He sighed softly, then reached for a folder on his desk. He opened it, flipping through a few pages before stopping. When he looked back up at me, there was something different in his eyes. Concern, and maybe curiosity. $482,000, he said quietly. The number settled between us. Heavy, real. I nodded once. Thank you, I said. He watched me carefully. You're very calm, he noted. I've had time to think, I replied. There was a long silence. Then Brandon, he said slowly, what exactly are you considering? I leaned back slightly in my chair, choosing my words. Because what I was about to say would change everything. I want to help, I said. His expression softened immediately. That's very kind, he said. And anything you can contribute, I don't mean a donation. I interrupted gently. He stopped, completely. What do you mean, he asked. I took a breath. I mean, I want to take care of it. The words hung in the air, unmoving, unbelievable. For a moment, he didn't react, as if his mind hadn't caught up to what he had just heard. Then, Brandon, he said slowly. That's not possible. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. I placed it on the desk between us. He looked at it, then back at me. What is this, he asked. Information, I said. He opened it carefully. Inside were documents, bank statements, account summaries, proof. He flipped through them slowly. At first, his expression was focused, analytical. Then, it changed. His eyes widened slightly. His posture shifted, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked speechless. He looked up at me. This, he began, then stopped. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to explain. The truth was right there in front of him. I don't understand, he said, finally. You don't need to, I replied softly. I do, he insisted. This is Brandon. This is more than enough. I know. He stared at me, still trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the reality sitting in front of him. How long, he asked. A long time, I said. And no one, I confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This changes everything, he murmured. I nodded. Yes. Another silence settled between us, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just real. There's something else, I said. He looked at me again. What is it? If I do this, I began choosing each word carefully. I need you to promise me something. He straightened slightly. Anything, he said. It has to remain anonymous. The words landed harder than I expected. He frowned. Brandon, it's important, I said. He shook his head slightly. People should know, he said. They should thank you. They should... No, I interrupted, my voice still calm but unyielding. They shouldn't. He studied me again. Why, he asked. I held his gaze, because the answer was simple. They wouldn't understand, I said quietly. He didn't respond immediately, but I could see it. The moment he began to realize, this wasn't just about money. This was about something deeper. Something personal? Are you sure, he asked? Yes. And your family, he added carefully. I felt a small, almost invisible shift inside me. They don't need to know, I said. Not now. Maybe not ever. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then, after a pause, I promise. I felt something inside me settle. Not relief, not exactly, but certainty. Then we can begin, I said. He looked at the papers again, then back at me, and for the first time, he smiled. Not the polite smile from Sunday. Not the tired one from earlier. But something genuine. Something full of hope. I think he said quietly, this might be the answer we've been praying for. I stood. So did he. But as I turned to leave, I paused at the door. Because something inside me whispered a quiet truth. This wasn't just the beginning of saving the church. It was the beginning of something else. Something my family wasn't prepared for, and something I had kept hidden for far too long. After that meeting, life didn't suddenly become dramatic. There were no immediate revelations, no sudden confrontations. Instead, everything became quieter. And in that quiet, something far more unsettling began to unfold. At first, it was small. A phone call from Ethan, unusual because he rarely called without a reason. Hey, Mom, he said, his voice lighter than I expected. Just checking in. Checking in. I almost smiled. I'm doing fine, I replied. That's good, he said quickly. That's good. There was a pause. I waited. Because I had learned something over the years, people who call just to check in rarely mean it. So he continued, clearing his throat slightly. I've been looking at some investment opportunities lately. There it was. Not concern, not connection. A purpose. That sounds promising, I said. Yeah, he replied. There's this property, really great location, high potential return. But the timing's tight. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch. Not to make him uncomfortable, but to give him space to say what he really meant. I might need a little help, he added finally. A little help. The words felt almost rehearsed. How much, I asked calmly. Nothing major, he said quickly. Just a short-term thing, maybe 10,000. I'd pay you back in a couple months. 10,000. To him, it was nothing major, to the version of me he believed in. It should have been impossible, and yet he asked anyway. That told me something. He didn't see me as capable, but he still saw me as available. I'll think about it, I said. There was a flicker of disappointment in his tone. Oh. Okay, he replied. Yeah, no pressure, of course. No pressure. We ended the call shortly after. And as I set the phone down, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but recognition. This wasn't about helping me anymore. It was about using what they thought I had left. 2 days later, Melissa called. That more than anything confirmed it. Brandon, she said brightly. I was just thinking about you. I almost laughed. That's kind of you, I replied. I wanted to see how you were doing, she continued. Ethan mentioned you seemed a little off the other night. Off? I pictured her saying that word with a concerned expression. Practiced, polished. I'm fine, I said. That's good, she replied quickly. We just worry about you, you know, especially with everything going on. Everything going on. They always spoke in vague terms when it suited them. I appreciate that, I said. Another pause. Then, well, she said, her tone shifting just slightly. We've had some unexpected expenses come up. Repairs mostly. Of course. There's always something, I replied. Yes, she agreed, a hint of relief in her voice as if I was making this easier for her. And we're a little tight right now. I waited, because now I knew the pattern. We were wondering, she continued carefully, if you might be able to help us out. Just temporarily. Temporarily. The same word Ethan had used. Different voice, same script. How much, I asked again. 5,000, she said. We'd pay you back as soon as things settle. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'll consider it, I replied. Her enthusiasm dimmed slightly. Of course, she said. Take your time. But I could hear it, the expectation. They didn't think I would say no, because in their minds, I had nothing to lose. Later that week, Diane stopped by. Unannounced as usual. She walked in without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the house as if inspecting it. Still the same, she said. I smiled faintly. Yes, it is. She sat down, crossing her legs, and looked at me with that familiar expression, half concern, half judgment. I heard you went to church earlier this week, she said. I paused. How did you hear that? Ethan mentioned it, she replied. He said you've been spending more time there lately. I nodded slowly. It's important to me. Diane leaned forward slightly. I hope you're not getting too involved, she said. Too involved. With what I asked. With their problems, she replied. I heard they're struggling financially. Diane leaned forward slightly. I hope you're not getting too involved, she said. Too involved. With what I asked. With their problems, she replied. I heard they're struggling financially. Of course she had. News travels quickly when it carries worry. They are, I said. She sighed. Brandon, you need to be careful, she said. You're not in a position to help anyone else right now. There it was again. That assumption. That quiet certainty about my limitations. I'll keep that in mind, I said. She studied me for a moment. You've always been too generous, she added. It's not practical. Practical. That word again. Not practical. Practical. That word again. Always that word. And sometimes, she continued, people take advantage of that. I almost smiled, because for once, she was right. Just not in the way she thought. After she left, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty. Just always that word. And sometimes, she continued, people take advantage of that. I almost smiled, because for once, she was right. Just not in the way she thought. After she left, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just clearer, because now everything was out in the open. Not the truth about me, but the truth about them. Ethan asking for money, Melissa following up, Diane warning me while still believing I had nothing to give. They all saw me the same way, not as a person, but as a situation, a problem to manage, a resource to use, and for the first time, I stopped questioning whether I was being too harsh in my thoughts, because the pattern was undeniable. That evening, I sat at my desk again. The same drawer, the same folder. I opened it slowly, looking at the numbers once more. Not to reassure myself, but to remind myself of something important. I wasn't powerless. I had choices, and those choices mattered. I reached for my phone, not to call Ethan, not to call Melissa, but to check something else. The transfer schedule, the payments to the church. Everything was moving forward, steady, controlled, quiet, just the way I wanted it. And yet, as I sat there staring at the numbers, a new thought began to form. One I hadn't fully considered before. What would happen when the truth finally came out? Because it would. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But eventually, something would slip. A glance, a word, a moment. And when it did, everything they believed about me would shatter. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, because I realized something else. This wasn't just about helping the church anymore. This was about boundaries, about respect, about deciding who deserved access to my life and who didn't. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the windows, a quiet reminder that change was already in motion. And as I sat there in the dim light, one thought settled firmly in my mind. I had spent years letting them believe I was weak. But now, they were about to learn just how wrong they had been. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The kind of afternoon that feels ordinary in every possible way, quiet, predictable, almost forgettable. And yet it became the moment I stopped seeing my family the same way ever again. I hadn't planned to leave the house, but I realized I was out of tea, and that small inconvenience was enough to send me to the grocery store. Life has a strange way of placing you exactly where you need to be when you least expect it. When I returned home, something felt off. Not immediately, not obvious, just a subtle shift in the air. The front door was closed just as I had left it. The curtains were still drawn. Everything looked the same, but something inside me tightened. Instinct. The kind you don't question, you just follow. I stepped inside quietly, placing my keys on the table without making a sound. And then I heard it. Voices. Low, muffled, coming from the living room. I froze, because I recognized them. Ethan, Melissa, and Diane. My heart didn't race. It didn't panic. It just slowed, as if my body already knew what I was about to hear. I moved closer, my footsteps soft against the floor. And then we can't wait forever. It didn't panic. It just slowed, as if my body already knew what I was about to hear. I moved closer, my footsteps soft against the floor. And then, we can't wait forever, Ethan was saying. His tone was sharp, frustrated. This place is falling apart, Melissa added. And honestly, it's not safe for her anymore. Her. Not Mom, not Brandon. Her. I stood just outside the doorway, unseen, listening. She's not going to agree easily, Diane said. You know how she is, stubborn? Ethan exhaled loudly. Then we don't give her a choice. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they were certain. What do you mean? Melissa asked. I mean, Ethan exhaled loudly. Then we don't give her a choice. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they were certain. What do you mean? Melissa asked. I mean, Ethan said, lowering his voice slightly. We start preparing now. We talk to a realtor, get an evaluation. If we show her the numbers, how much she could get for the house, it'll make sense to her. I felt something cold settle in my chest. They weren't asking. They weren't discussing. They were planning. Behind my back. She won't like it, Melissa said. She doesn't have to like it, Ethan replied. She just has to understand it's the best option. For who, Diane asked. There was a brief pause. For everyone, Ethan said finally. Everyone. I almost stepped into the room then. Almost. But something held me back. Because I needed to hear more. She's not managing well, Melissa continued. You saw her the other night. She's clearly struggling. Struggling. Again? That word. I think she's embarrassed, Diane added. That's why she won't admit it. Ethan sighed. Well, whether she admits it or not, we can't just sit back and watch her ruin everything. Ruin everything. I closed my eyes for just a moment, because in that sentence, everything became clear. They didn't just misunderstand me. They had rewritten my entire life into something that fit their narrative. A fragile woman, a failing situation, a problem to fix. And the solution? Take control. Without asking. Without listening. Without even considering that they might be wrong. I can handle the paperwork, Ethan continued. Once we get things moving, it'll be easier to convince her. Convince? Or pressure? Or push? Or corner? The words blurred together. Melissa's voice softened slightly. And what about where she'll go? There are plenty of retirement communities, Diane said quickly. She'll be fine. Fine. That word again. So easy. So empty. And the money Melissa asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Ethan cleared his throat. Well, selling the house would give her something to live on, he said carefully. Something to live on. Not security. Not independence. Just enough. And if she needs help managing it, he added, I can take care of that. Of course he could, because in their minds, I couldn't. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not yet, but something deeper, something steadier. A realization. They weren't just underestimating me. They were positioning themselves. Quietly. Carefully. Step by step. Until I no longer had a say. Until my life became something they managed. Controlled. Decided. And the worst part, they believed they were doing the right thing. I stepped back silently, my mind clearer than it had been in years. Then deliberately, I made a small noise just enough. A step. A shift. Something to announce my presence without revealing how long I had been there. The voices inside stopped instantly. I walked into the living room. 3 faces turned toward me. Surprised. Unprepared. Brandon Melissa said, quickly standing up. We didn't hear you come in. I just got back, I replied calmly. Ethan forced a smile. Hey, Mom, he said. We were just talking. I heard I said. Just enough truth to make them uneasy, but not enough to expose everything. Diane crossed her arms slightly. We were concerned about you, she said. Of course they were. I'm doing fine, I replied. Ethan stepped forward. Mom, we actually wanted to talk to you about something. I met his gaze. I imagine you did. He hesitated. Just for a second, because something in my voice had changed. Not louder, not sharper, just firmer. It's about the house, he said. There it was, out in the open now. I think it might be time to consider selling, he continued. For your safety, for your comfort. Melissa nodded quickly. It would really be better for you, she added. Better for me. I looked at each of them in turn, taking my time, letting the silence stretch just long enough. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself, or defend myself, or soften anything. I'm not selling my house, I said. Simple, clear, final. Ethan blinked. Mom, no, I said gently but firmly. He stopped. Completely. I understand you think you're helping, I continued. But this is my home, and I am not leaving it. Diane scoffed softly. You're being unrealistic, she said. I turned to her. No, I replied. I'm being very clear. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. We just want what's best for you, she said again. I almost smiled, because now I finally understood what they wanted, what they believed, and what they were willing to do. But more importantly, I understood something else. They had already crossed a line. And once that line is crossed, things don't go back to the way they were. They change, permanently. I looked at Ethan one last time. I'll take care of myself, I said quietly. And this time, I meant it in a way he couldn't possibly misunderstand. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that everything they were planning, everything they were trying to control, was about to slip completely out of their hands. After that day, something inside me changed permanently. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was final. For years, I had chosen patience, silence, distance. I had allowed assumptions to exist because they protected me from something worse: expectation, dependency, obligation. But now, those same assumptions had turned into something else: control. And I could no longer ignore it. The next few days, I said nothing to Ethan, nothing to Melissa, nothing to Diane, not because I was unsure, but because I was certain. And when you're certain, you don't rush. You prepare. That Friday morning, I called Pastor Michael again. Brandon, he said, his voice lighter this time. I was actually hoping to hear from you. I wanted to ask how things are progressing, I said. There was a pause, then something I hadn't heard before: relief. We've begun the process, he said. The bank has been contacted. They're reviewing the documents you provided. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. And they're surprised, he admitted. I allowed myself a small smile. I imagined they would be. Brandon, he continued, his tone shifting slightly. I want to say again, this is extraordinary. What you're doing? It's necessary, I said quietly. And I meant that, not just for the church, but for something deeper, more personal. When will everything be finalized? I asked. If everything goes smoothly, he said, within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That was all. 2 weeks until the debt that had weighed on that place for years would disappear, and no one would know how, or why, or who. Keep me informed, I said. Of course, he replied. We ended the call shortly after. And as I set the phone down, I felt something unfamiliar. Not tension, not hesitation, but anticipation. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't just something I carried quietly. It was something that was moving, building, getting closer to the surface. That same afternoon, Ethan showed up again, unannounced. But this time, I wasn't surprised. I opened the door and found him standing there, hands in his pockets, that same careful expression on his face. Hey, Mom, he said. Ethan, I replied calmly. What brings you here? He hesitated, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I wanted to talk, he said. I closed the door behind him. So did I replied. He glanced around the house again, always looking, always evaluating, as if he was already imagining it empty. Sold. Gone. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, he began. And I asked. He exhaled slowly. I think you're being too resistant, he said. We're trying to help you, and you're shutting us out? I studied him for a moment, because what he said sounded reasonable. But it wasn't true. I'm not shutting you out, I replied. I'm setting a boundary. He frowned. That's not how it feels, he said. That's because you're not used to it, I said gently. That caught him off guard. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Mom, he said finally, you don't have to do everything alone. I almost smiled, because if there was one thing he didn't understand, it was that I wasn't alone, not in the way he meant. I'm not alone, I said. He shook his head. You live by, I said. He shook his head. You live by yourself. You don't ask for help. You don't share anything about your situation. How is that not alone? Because you don't see me. The thought stayed in my mind, unspoken. I manage just fine, I yourself. You don't ask for help. You don't share anything about your situation. How is that not alone? Because you don't see me. The thought stayed in my mind, unspoken. I manage just fine, I said. He sighed again. Look, I'm not trying to argue, he said, but we've already started looking into options. There it was, out in the open. You've what I asked. His tone shifted slightly. Defensive now. Just preliminary stuff, he said quickly. Nothing official. Just exploring. Exploring. Behind my back. Without my consent. Without even telling me. And you thought that was appropriate? I asked calmly. He hesitated. I thought it was necessary, he replied. Necessary. That word again. Always justified. Always reasonable. From his perspective. This is my home, I said quietly. I know, he said, and I'm trying to protect you. From what I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't have a real answer, not one he could say out loud. From making a mistake, I know, he said, and I'm trying to protect you. From what I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't have a real answer, not one he could say out loud. From making a mistake, he said finally. I nodded slowly. I see. There was a long silence, but this time it didn't feel uncertain. It felt decisive. Because I realized something in that moment. Ethan didn't trust me, not my judgment, not my decisions, not my ability to take care of myself. And once trust is gone, everything else begins to shift. I need you to listen to me, I said. He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in a long while. I am not selling this house, I continued. Not now. Not later. Not because you think it's a good idea. His jaw tightened slightly. Mom? No, I said again. You've made your position clear. Now I'm making mine. He stared at me, and I could see it. Frustration, confusion, and something else. Something closer to doubt. Because for the first time, I wasn't bending. I don't understand why you're being like this, he said. I held his gaze. Because you've stopped asking what I want, I replied. That landed, harder than anything else I had said. He looked away, just for a second, but it was enough. I'm your son, he said quietly. I know. I replied. Then trust me, he added. I felt something soften in my chest, just slightly, because beneath everything, he still believed he was doing the right thing. But belief doesn't make something right. I do trust you, I said. He looked back at me, hope flickering briefly in his eyes. But I trust myself more. I finished. That hope faded, and in its place, silence. He didn't argue after that, didn't push, didn't insist. He just stood there for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said, but it wasn't agreement. It was retreat, temporary, unresolved. I should go, he added. I walked him to the door, and as he stepped outside, he turned back once more. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said. I almost laughed, because he still didn't understand. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about protecting something. Something he didn't even know existed. I know, I replied. And then he left. I closed the door gently behind him and leaned against it for just a moment, because I could feel it now. Everything was building towards something inevitable. The church, the money, the truth. And when it finally came out, it wouldn't just change how they saw me. It would change everything they thought they knew. And somehow, something inevitable. The church, the money, the truth. And when it finally came out, it wouldn't just change how they saw me. It would change everything they thought they knew. And somehow, I had a feeling they weren't ready for that. Not even close. The first sign that everything was about to shift came in the smallest, quietest way. A letter. Plain, unremarkable. Slipped into my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. I almost didn't open it right away. It looked like any other piece of mail. No urgency, no bold lettering, nothing that demanded attention. But something inside me knew. So I brought it inside, set my purse down, and carefully opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Official. Clean. Precise. My eyes moved slowly across the words, and then they stopped. The mortgage has been fully satisfied. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react, because for a moment, the world felt completely still. Fully satisfied. Paid. Gone. Just like that. Years of weight lifted in a single sentence. I lowered the paper slowly, my fingers trembling just slightly. Not from fear, not from doubt, but from something deeper. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that exact moment. Relief. Not just for the church, but for something inside me. Something that had carried this decision, this responsibility, this quiet truth for weeks. It was done. Completely. Irreversibly. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the paper again. And then I smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just real. Because I had done exactly what I set out to do. Quietly. Without recognition. Without expectation. Exactly the way I wanted. But as that feeling settled, another thought followed close behind. Now what? Because even though I had asked Pastor Michael to keep everything anonymous, the world doesn't always cooperate with silence, especially when something this big happens. By Thursday, the news had spread. Not how, not exactly. But it had. I arrived at church that morning for a small midweek gathering, and I could feel it immediately. The energy had changed. People were talking, smiling, confused, relieved, all at once. Mrs. Patterson rushed toward me as soon as she saw me. "Brandon!" she exclaimed. "Have you heard?" I tilted my head slightly. "Heard what?" I asked. Her eyes widened. "The mortgage," she said. "It's gone, completely paid off." I let a small, controlled expression of surprise cross my face. "Is that so?" I said. "Yes," she replied. "Pastor Michael announced it this morning. No one knows who did it, but oh, Brandon, it's a miracle." "A miracle?" I nodded slowly. "I suppose it is," I said. She reached out, squeezing my hand. "God works in ways we don't understand," she added. I met her gaze. "Yes," I replied quietly. "He does." Inside, Pastor Michael stood near the front speaking with a group of people. This time, his smile reached his eyes. When he saw me, something in his expression shifted, just slightly. Recognition, understanding, gratitude. But he didn't say anything. He simply nodded. And that was enough. The service that day felt lighter than any I had attended in years. Not because of the words, but because of the feeling. Hope, relief, a sense that something impossible had just become real. And through it all, I sat quietly in my usual place. Just another face in the crowd, exactly as I had intended. But outside those walls, things were beginning to move in a very different direction. That evening, my phone rang. "Ethan." I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello, Mom," he said quickly. "Did you hear about the church?" I kept my voice steady. "Yes," I replied. "I heard—" "Someone paid off the entire mortgage," he continued. "Almost $500,000. Can you believe that?" I let a small pause settle. "It's remarkable," I said. "Remarkable," he repeated. "It's insane. Who even has that kind of money just sitting around?" I didn't answer, because I knew exactly who. "There's no way it's someone from the congregation," he added. "I mean, come on." I looked out the window, watching the fading light. "No," I said quietly. "I suppose not." He exhaled. "Well, whoever it is, they must be incredibly wealthy." Wealthy? The word felt different now. Not distant, not abstract. Just true. "I guess so," I replied. There was a pause. "Then, you're still going there, right?" he asked. "Yes." "Maybe you should be careful," he said. "Places like that, when money's involved, things can get complicated." I almost smiled. "If you say so," I replied. We ended the call shortly after, but that wasn't the only one. Melissa called the next morning. "Brandon, have you heard?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," I said again. "This is huge," she continued. "I mean, someone just paid everything, just like that." "Yes." She hesitated. "Do you think it's real?" she asked. "I do." Another pause. "Who do you think did it?" she pressed. I let the question hang. "I don't know," I said. And technically, that was true, because the version of me they believed in could never have done it. By the weekend, even Diane had something to say. "This kind of thing doesn't just happen," she said, sitting across from me once again. "There's always a reason behind it." "I'm sure there is," I replied. She narrowed her eyes slightly. "You don't seem surprised," she observed. I met her gaze calmly. Should I be? She studied me for a moment longer than usual, as if trying to find something. A crack, a clue. But there was nothing to find, because I had spent years perfecting this. Silence, control, stillness. And now, it was protecting me in a way I had never expected. But something had changed, not just for the church, not just for me, but for them. Because curiosity has a way of growing, of pushing, of digging deeper, and I could feel it now, in the questions, in the glances, in the subtle shift in their tone. They didn't know the truth, not yet, but they were starting to realize there was more going on than they understood. And when that realization turns into certainty, that's when everything changes. I sat alone that night, the house quiet around me. The same walls, the same creaking floors, the same life. And yet, everything felt different, because the truth was no longer hidden in action. It had left a mark, a visible one. And it was only a matter of time before someone followed that mark back to me. I folded my hands together and looked toward Thomas' photograph. "It's done," I said softly. And for the first time, I wondered not about what I had done, but about what would happen next. It didn't take long. Curiosity rarely stays quiet for long, especially when there's money involved. By the following week, the questions had started to change. They were no longer casual, no longer curious in a distant, harmless way. They were focused. And somehow, without realizing it, my family had moved from wondering what happened to wondering who did it. And more dangerously, could it be someone they knew? It began with Diane. Of course it did. She had always been the kind of person who didn't let things go once something didn't make sense to her. She showed up again on a Monday afternoon. No call, no warning, just like always. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. Something sharper. More deliberate. "You've been going to church a lot lately," she said, settling into her usual seat as if she owned it. "I have," I replied calmly. She nodded slowly. "And now this happens," she added. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because she wasn't asking a question. She was building a thought. "I've been thinking," she nodded slowly. "And now this happens," she added. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because she wasn't asking a question. She was building a thought. "I've been thinking," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "Whoever paid that kind of money, they had to be connected somehow." "That seems reasonable," I said. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "You don't seem very interested in finding out who it was," she observed. I met her gaze. "Does it matter?" I asked. That caught her off guard. "Of course it matters," she said. "People don't just give away $500,000 without a reason." I let a small silence settle between us. "Maybe they had one," I said quietly. She studied me carefully, longer than usual, as if trying to read something beneath the surface, and for the first time, I could feel it. She was getting closer. Not to the truth itself, but to the possibility that her assumptions might be wrong, and that alone was enough to make her uncomfortable. "You've been different lately," she said. "How so?" I asked. "Calmer," she replied, "less reactive." I almost smiled, because she was right, but not for the reasons she thought. "I suppose I've had time to think," I said. About what matters." I answered simply. That seemed to frustrate her, because it didn't give her anything to hold on to, anything to challenge, anything to dissect. And Diane needed something to dissect. She stood up shortly after that, clearly unsatisfied. "This isn't over," she said. I nodded. "No," I replied, "it isn't, because I knew something she didn't. She wasn't looking for the truth. She was looking for confirmation, and the truth would give her the opposite." 2 days later, Ethan called again, but this time, his tone was different, less confident, more careful. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something." I leaned back in my chair. "All right?" He hesitated. Then, "Have you noticed anything unusual at church lately?" There it was. Direct, focused. I kept my voice steady. "Unusual how?" "About the donation?" he clarified. "The mortgage being paid off." "I've noticed people are relieved," I said. "That's not what I mean," he said quickly. Of course it wasn't. "I've been thinking," he continued. "What if it's someone local, someone we know?" My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table. "And what makes you think that?" I asked. "Because it doesn't make sense otherwise," he replied. Why would a stranger just do that? I didn't answer right away. Because his question had an answer, just not one he was ready for. "Sometimes people do things without needing a reason others understand," I said. He exhaled. "That's not how the world works," he said. I almost smiled. "Because that's exactly how the world works. Just not the world he believes in. Maybe not your world," I replied quietly. There was a pause, and in that pause, I could feel it. Doubt. Not about the situation, but about me. "Mom," he said slowly, "this might sound strange, but—" He stopped. "Go on," I said. "Is there anything you're not telling me?" The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I closed my eyes for just a second, because this was it, the moment where everything could shift. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. I opened my eyes again and answered carefully. "There are many things I haven't told you," I said. Silence. On the other end of the line, heavy, expectant, like what he asked. I looked toward the window again. The same quiet street. The same still afternoon. "The kind of things you never asked about," I replied. That wasn't the answer he wanted, and we both knew it. "Mom," he said, his voice tightening slightly, "this isn't a game." "I know," I said. "Then why does it feel like you're hiding something?" "Because I am." The truth sat quietly in my mind, unmoving, unapologetic. But instead I said, "Maybe you're just starting, to realize you don't know everything." "Then why does it feel like you're hiding something?" "Because I am." The truth sat quietly in my mind, unmoving, unapologetic. But instead I said, "Maybe you're just starting to realize you don't know everything." That hit harder than I expected. He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter, different. "I thought I did," he admitted. I felt something shift in my chest, just slightly, because beneath everything, there was still something human there, something real. "You knew what I allowed you to see?" I said gently. "And now?" he asked. I paused. Because now, everything was changing. "Now," I said slowly, "you're starting to see more." He didn't push after that, didn't argue, didn't demand answers. He simply said, "I'll call you later," and hung up. I set the phone down carefully, because I could feel it now, the shift. Not just in him, but in everything. The assumptions were cracking. The narrative was breaking. And once that begins, it doesn't stop. That evening, I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Thomas's photograph sat in its usual place, unchanged, steady. I walked over and picked it up. "You always said the truth finds its way out," I murmured. And now it was starting to. Not in one dramatic moment, not in a single revelation, but in pieces, questions, doubts, realizations. And soon, those pieces would come together, not because I forced them to, but because they couldn't be ignored anymore. I placed the photograph back down gently. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder when the truth finally becomes undeniable. Will they regret the way they treated me? Or will they simply try to rewrite the story again? Because one thing was certain. The next time they looked at me, they wouldn't see the same person anymore, and neither would I. The truth didn't come out the way I expected. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was an accident. Or perhaps I thought later it was inevitable. Because when something is hidden long enough, the world has a way of uncovering it for you. It happened the following Sunday. The church was fuller than usual. Word had spread beyond our small congregation. People from neighboring towns had come curious about what everyone was calling the miracle. I sat in my usual seat, hands folded in my lap, listening as Pastor Michael spoke. His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. Emotion, gratitude, and sometimes he said, looking out across the room, "We receive blessings we don't fully understand. Acts of kindness so profoundals beneath it. Emotion, gratitude." And sometimes he said, looking out across the room, "We receive blessings we don't fully understand. Acts of kindness so profound, they remind us what faith truly looks like." A quiet murmur moved through the room. I kept my eyes forward. Still, invisible, just as I had intended. But something felt different that morning. Not outside. Inside. A quiet tension, as if something was about to shift. After the service, people gathered in small groups, talking, smiling, speculating. I stayed back, letting the crowd move ahead of me. That's when I heard my name. "Brandon!" I turned. Pastor Michael stood a few feet away, his expression calm but serious. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. I hesitated, just slightly, because something in his tone told me this wasn't routine. "Of course," I said. He led me toward his office, closing the door behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, "There's been a development," he said. I felt my chest tighten just a little. "What kind of development?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "The bank made an error," he said. My stomach dropped. "What kind of error?" I repeated. His eyes met mine. "They contacted the church again this morning," he continued. "Apparently, during the processing of the final payment, some information was not fully restricted." I didn't move, didn't speak, because I already understood. "They know," I said, quietly. He nodded. "Not everyone," he clarified, "but someone saw the name attached to the transfer." A long silence filled the room. Heavy, unavoidable. "Who?" I asked. He hesitated. "Then Diane," he said. "Of course. Of all people, of course it was her. She was reviewing some community donation records," he added. "There was a document, and your name was listed." I closed my eyes briefly. Not in panic, not in fear, but in acceptance. Because this was always a possibility. What exactly did she see? I asked. The full amount, he said quietly. I nodded once. That was enough. More than enough. And now I asked. She hasn't said anything publicly, he replied. But she left immediately after. Of course she did. Because Diane didn't react impulsively. She observed. She processed. And then she acted. She's going to tell them, I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. But his silence was answer enough. I took a slow breath, and for a moment, everything became very clear. This was it, the moment I had been quietly preparing for. Not in words, not in plans, but in acceptance. Do you want me to deny it? He asked gently. I looked at him, really looked at him, because that question mattered more than anything else, and the answer would change everything. No, I said. His brow furrowed slightly. Are you sure? Yes. He studied me carefully. This could create complications, he said, with your family. I almost smiled. It already has, I replied. There was a pause. Then, why? He asked softly. Why not keep it hidden like you intended? I considered the question. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to say it honestly. Because hiding it protected them, I said quietly. He tilted his head slightly. How so? I met his gaze. It allowed them to believe what they wanted. I explained that I was fragile, that I needed them, that I couldn't manage on my own. And now? He asked. I took a breath. Now they'll have to face something else. What's that? The truth? I said. We stood in silence for a moment longer. Then I nodded once. I should go, I added. He didn't stop me. Because he understood. This wasn't something that could be managed from inside that office. This was something I had to face directly. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, sharper, colder, even though the sun was still shining. Because something had changed. Not in the world, but in what the world now knew about me. I drove home slowly, deliberately, because I knew what was waiting. And I wasn't wrong. When I pulled into the driveway, 3 cars were already there. Ethan's, Melissa's, and Diane's. Of course. I sat in the car for just a moment longer, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing evenly, because I knew. The moment I stepped inside, there would be no more silence, no more assumptions, no more pretending, just truth, raw, unfiltered, unavoidable. I opened the door and stepped out. The walk to the front door felt longer than usual, heavier, but not because I was afraid, because I was ready. When I opened the door, they were all there, standing, waiting. No one spoke at first, but I could see it in their faces. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Their faces. Shock, confusion, disbelief. And something else, something deeper, something they hadn't yet found words for. Diane was the first to speak. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Is it true? She asked. No accusation, no judgment, just and something else, something deeper, something they hadn't yet found words for. Diane was the first to speak. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Is it true?" she asked. No accusation, no judgment, just uncertainty. I stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to protect them or myself. "Yes," I said. The word landed like a weight in the room. Ethan stared at me, unmoving. "That was you?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." Melissa shook her head slightly. "That's not possible," she whispered. But it was, and they knew it, because the truth doesn't ask for permission. It simply exists. How Ethan asked. The question wasn't just about money. It was about everything. Years of assumptions, years of misunderstanding, years of believing something that wasn't real. I looked at him, calm, steady. "The same way I've done everything else," I said, quietly. Silence filled the room, thick, heavy, unavoidable. And in that silence, I watched something happen. Something I had never seen before. Their certainty collapsed, piece by piece, because everything they thought they knew about me was gone. The silence after my answer didn't break right away. It stretched, thick, uncomfortable, heavy in a way none of them were prepared for. Because there are moments in life when everything you believe about someone collapses at once, and your mind doesn't know how to rebuild it. This was one of those moments. Ethan was the first to move, not speak, just move. He took a step back, as if putting distance between himself and the reality standing in front of him. "That doesn't make sense," he said finally. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was disoriented. "It does," I replied calmly. "No." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No, it doesn't. You said—" He stopped, because he didn't know how to finish that sentence. "You said you were struggling. You said things were tight. You said—" But I hadn't. Not really. I had simply never corrected them. Melissa spoke next, her voice trembling slightly. "Brandon, that's almost $500,000, she said. "I know," I replied. "And you're telling us you just had that?" she asked. I held her gaze. "Yes." The word hit her harder than anything else, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was simple, certain, real. Diane hadn't spoken yet, but I could feel her watching me, analyzing, reconstructing, recalculating everything she thought she knew. "How long?" she asked quietly. I turned to her. "How long what?" "How long have you had that kind of money?" she clarified. I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood what she was really asking. "How long have we been wrong about you?" Long enough I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood what she was really asking. "How long have we been wrong about you?" "Long enough," I said. That wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. Ethan let out a short, hollow laugh. "So, all this time," he said, shaking his head, "all this time we thought—" He stopped again, because now saying it out loud would expose something else, something deeper, something uncomfortable. "We thought you were struggling," Melissa finished softly. I nodded. "I know." There it was. No denial, no deflection, just acknowledgement. And you didn't say anything? Ethan asked. I met his eyes. You didn't ask? I replied. That landed, harder than anything else, because it wasn't just about money. It was about attention, assumption, neglect disguised as concern. That's not fair, he said quickly. Isn't it? I asked gently. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because somewhere deep down he knew. He knew there were things he had never asked, never noticed, never questioned. Diane leaned forward slightly. You let us believe you were incapable, she said. The word hung in the air. Sharp, accurate, painful. I let you believe what you chose to believe. I replied. Her eyes narrowed. That's not the same thing. It is when you never look closer, I said. Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not confusion, not disbelief, something else. Something heavier. Guilt. Melissa sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly together. I don't understand, she said quietly. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't answer immediately. Because this question deserved more than a simple response, because it wouldn't have changed anything I said. Ethan frowned. It would have changed everything he argued. I shook my head. No, I said. It would have changed how you treated me, not how you saw me. He stared at me, trying to understand, trying to argue, trying to find something to hold on to. But that's the same thing, he insisted. No, I said softly. It's not. Because being treated differently out of respect is not the same as being respected. And for years, I had known the difference. Diane stood up slowly. You're saying this is our fault, she said. I looked at her. No, I replied. I'm saying this is the result. The result of what? She pressed. I took a breath. Of assumptions, I said. Of decisions made without me. Of conversations held about me instead of with me. No one spoke, because they couldn't deny it. Not anymore. Ethan's voice softened slightly. We were trying to help you, he said. I know, I replied. Then why does it feel like we did something wrong? He asked. I held his gaze. Because you stopped seeing me as someone who could decide for herself. I said. That was it. The core of everything. The truth they hadn't been willing to face. Melissa wiped her eyes quickly. We were worried about you, she whispered. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, just understanding. I know, I said again, and I appreciate that. They looked at me surprised, because that wasn't what they expected. Not after everything, but worry doesn't give you the right to take control. I continued. Ethan looked down. Diane didn't argue. Melissa didn't speak, because now they understood. Not everything, but enough. After a long moment, Ethan asked the question that had been building since the beginning. Why the church? He said quietly. I smiled, just slightly, because that question, that one mattered, because they needed it, I said. That's it? Diane asked. That's enough, I replied. Ethan shook his head slowly. You gave away that much money just because they needed it. I nodded. Yes. He let out a breath, almost a laugh. I don't think he'll ever understand that, he admitted. I looked at him. You don't have to, I said. Another silence. But this one was softer, less sharp, less defensive. Because something had shifted. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to change the direction. Melissa stood up slowly. I think we owe you an apology, she said. Diane didn't speak, but she didn't disagree either. Ethan looked at me. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. I nodded. Thank you, I said. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a confrontation anymore. It felt like something else, something fragile, something new, the beginning of understanding, but also the end of something old. Because no matter what came next, they would never see me the same way again, and neither would I. The house felt different after that conversation. Not physically. The same walls stood, the same furniture remained, the same quiet filled the rooms, but something had shifted beneath all of it. Something invisible but undeniable. They didn't stay long after the truth came out. No arguments, no raised voices, just silence. Heavy, reflective silence. Ethan was the first to leave. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle, as if he wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. I'll call you, he said finally. I nodded. Take your time. Melissa followed shortly after, her usual confidence replaced with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. She looked at me differently now, not with pity, not with polite distance, but with something closer to humility. I didn't see you clearly, she admitted softly. I held her gaze. No, I said. You didn't. But there was no anger in my voice, because anger would have been too easy and too late. Diane was the last to leave. Of course she was. She had always needed the final word. But this time, she didn't have one. She stood in front of me for a long moment, studying my face, as if trying to understand how she had missed something so significant. I was wrong about you, she said finally. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her. Heavy, unpracticed, honest. Yes, I replied. She let out a slow breath. I don't like being wrong, she admitted. I know, I said. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched her lips. But I suppose this time I deserved it. Honest. Yes, I replied. She let out a slow breath. I don't like being wrong, she admitted. I know, I said. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched her lips. But I suppose this time I deserved it. I didn't respond, because she did, and she knew it. She hesitated, then added, You didn't just prove us wrong, Brandon. I raised an eyebrow slightly. No, she shook her head. You showed us something we didn't want to see. And what's that, I asked. She looked at me carefully. That we stopped listening a long time ago. That landed deeper than anything else she had said, because it wasn't defensive, it wasn't dismissive, it was accurate. She nodded once, then turned and walked out. And just like that, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet. This one felt earned. That night, I sat in the living room with the lamp on Lo Thomas's photograph, resting in my hands. Well, I said softly, that didn't go the way I expected. I could almost hear his voice. Not surprised, not shocked, just amused, because he had always understood something I was still learning. The truth doesn't just reveal itself, it reshapes everything around it. The next few days passed slowly, carefully. Ethan didn't call right away. Melissa didn't reach out. Even Diane stayed quiet. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to fill that silence. Because sometimes space is necessary. Not distance. Space. The kind that allows people to think, to reflect, to reconsider. 3 days later, there was a knock on my door. Soft, uncertain. I opened it to find Ethan standing there. Alone. No Melissa. No rehearsed confidence. Just my son. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I replied. He shifted slightly as if unsure whether to step inside. I stepped back. "You can come in." He nodded and walked in slowly, glancing around the house in a way that felt different this time. Not critical, not evaluative, just observant. "I've been thinking," he said. "I assumed you would," I replied gently. He gave a small, nervous smile. "I didn't realize how much I had stopped seeing you," he admitted. I didn't interrupt, didn't soften it, because he needed to say it. "I thought I understood everything," he continued. "Your situation, your life, what you needed." And now I asked. He looked at me. Now I realize I was only seeing what I expected to see. That was closer. Closer to the truth. "I'm sorry," he said. This time it felt different. Not just words, not just obligation, something deeper. "I accept that," I replied. He nodded slowly. I also realized something else he added. "What's that I was trying to take control of your life because I didn't trust you," he said. The honesty in that statement surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because he was finally willing to say it. "And that wasn't fair," he added. "No." I agreed. It wasn't. We sat in silence for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just real. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," he said. "They won't," I replied. He nodded. I want to do better." I studied him for a moment, because this was the moment that mattered, not the apology, not the realization, but what came after. "Then start by listening," I said. He nodded again. "I will." Later that week, Melissa reached out. Not with a request, not with a story, just a message. "I'd like to come by and talk if you're open to it." That alone told me something had changed. And Diane. She didn't apologize again, but she started asking questions. Real ones, not to judge, not to correct, but to understand. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't immediate, but it was movement. And sometimes that's enough. As for me, I didn't suddenly become someone new. I didn't change my lifestyle. I didn't move houses. I didn't start spending differently, because none of that had ever been the point. The point was, I had stopped allowing others to define me. And once that happens, everything else begins to fall into place. That Sunday, I returned to church. Same pew, same quiet presence. But this time, something felt different. Not in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. Pastor Michael caught my eye briefly and nodded. No words, no acknowledgement, just understanding. And that was exactly what I wanted, because in the end, this was never about being seen. It was about being known. And finally, I was. In the weeks that followed, nothing returned to what it used to be. And strangely, that was the best part, because for the first time in years, everything felt honest. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Ethan started coming by more often, but not the way he used to. He didn't walk in like he had something to fix. He didn't scan the house like he was evaluating it. He sat, he listened, and sometimes he didn't say much at all. One afternoon, we sat together at the kitchen table, the same one he had once used to plan how to sell my home. Now he ran his fingers lightly over the wood, thoughtful. "Dad built this, didn't he?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He smiled faintly. "I never really noticed before." I looked at him carefully. "That's because you weren't looking," I said gently. He didn't argue. didn't defend himself. He simply nodded. You're right. And that mattered more than anything else he could have said. Melissa changed too, but in a quieter way, less polished, less certain. She stopped telling stories about other people's lives as if they were standards to measure against. Instead, she started asking questions. Real ones. What made you decide to invest like that? She asked me one afternoon. How did you know when to trust your instincts? What was it like building something on your own? I answered her, not everything, but enough. Because for the first time, she wasn't comparing. She was learning. And Diane surprised me the most. She didn't suddenly become soft. That wasn't who she was, but she became careful, more aware of her words, more willing to pause before making assumptions. One evening, she sat across from me again, but this time, her posture was different. Less confrontational, more reflective. I spent a long time thinking I understood people just by observing them, she said. I listened, but I realize now I was only seeing what I expected to see. I nodded. That happens more often than people realize, I said. She gave a small, almost reluctant smile. I suppose I needed to be proven wrong in a very expensive way. I laughed softly. Maybe. She studied me for a moment. You could have told us, she said. I met her gaze. Yes, I replied. I could have, and you didn't, she added. No. Why I thought about that question again, even now, even after everything. Because I wanted to know who you were without it, I said. That answer stayed with her. I could see it, because it wasn't just about money. It was about truth. And truth has a way of settling in slowly. One Sunday, not long after everything had come to light, Pastor Michael made a brief announcement. We've received many questions about the generous act that saved this church, he said. The room was quiet, listening, curious. As promised, we will respect the wishes of the individual who made that contribution, he continued. But I will say this. He paused. This act was not just about money. I felt my hands tighten slightly in my lap. It was about faith, he said, and trust, and the quiet strength of someone who chose to give without needing to be seen. A few people nodded. Some wiped their eyes. And sometimes, he added, the greatest impact comes from the people we underestimate. That sentence lingered. Not loudly, but deeply. Because it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone in that room, everyone who had ever been overlooked, misjudged, misunderstood. After the service, I didn't stay long. I stepped outside the cool air brushing gently against my face. And for a moment, I just stood there, breathing, because something inside me felt complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was aligned. Ethan caught up to me just as I reached my car. Mom, he said. I turned. Yes. He hesitated. Then, I'm proud of you, he said. Simple, uncomplicated, honest. I smiled. Thank you. He nodded. And I'm trying to learn how to be someone you can be proud of too. That surprised me, not because of what he said, but because of how sincerely he meant it. You already are, I replied. He shook his head slightly. I have more to learn. I reached out and touched his arm gently. We all do, I said. And for the first time in a long time, that felt true for all of us. As I drove home, the sun dipped low across the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. The same streets, the same house, the same life. And yet, everything had changed. Not because I had revealed something, but because I had stopped hiding. Not just my finances, but myself. And that was the real transformation. Because money can change circumstances. But truth changes people. When I walked into my home that evening, I paused just inside the door. The familiar creak of the floor. The soft light filtering through the curtains. The quiet. Still mine. Still unchanged. But no longer misunderstood. I walked over to Thomas's photograph one last time. "Well," I said softly, "I think you'd be proud of how this turned out." And somehow, I knew he would be. Because in the end, this was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally allowing myself to be seen for who I had always been. Not fragile, not incapable, not someone waiting to be saved, but someone who had quietly built a life of strength and simply chose the right moment to let the world see it. After everything that happened, I kept thinking about one simple truth. People don't always misunderstand you because they don't care. Sometimes they misunderstand you because they stop paying attention. In my case, my family didn't suddenly become bad people. They became comfortable with assumptions, comfortable with not asking deeper questions, comfortable with believing a version of me that was easier to understand. And maybe you've experienced something like that too. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe someone looked at your life from the outside and decided they knew your whole story. Maybe you stayed quiet not because you had nothing to say, but because you were waiting for the right moment. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You don't need to prove your worth to people who only measure what they can see. But you do need to protect your truth. Because the moment you start living according to other people's assumptions, you slowly disappear inside your own life. And the moment you choose to stand in your truth, calmly, quietly, without needing approval, everything begins to change. Not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. So I want to ask you, have you ever been misunderstood by your own family? Have you ever stayed silent while people made the wrong assumptions about you? And if you were in my place, would you have told them the truth earlier or waited like I did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this, and sometimes they're exactly what someone needs to hear.